So, hello everybody, welcome to our Ask Us How training session. I'm just going to start with a couple of housekeeping things. So, first and most importantly, I hope you can all hear. If you have any technical difficulties or issues as we go through the talk or the session, pop it in the chat, because we're keeping an eye on the chat and we'll try and pick that up. Secondly, just about questions. So no one's actually submitted any questions to us in advance, which is not a problem because we're going to look at some very commonly asked questions. If you were hoping to ask us something, then we've got a bit of time for that at the end. If you've got questions relating to what we're saying as we go through the various topics, then pop it in the chat and we'll try and deal with that, in a sort of appropriate spot. So, moving on, I'd like to just introduce the panel to you. So starting with Karen Davidson, who's a senior archivist here at Gloucestershire Archives. Then we've got John Loosley, who's chair of Gloucestershire Family History Society. Another John Chandler of the Victoria County History Trust. And Sue, sorry, and last but not least, we've got Sue Webb, who's the Archives Officer for the Gloucestershire Constabulary. And both John Loosley and Sue have got a presence here at the Heritage Hub because the Constabulary Archives and the Gloucestershire Family History Society have both got an office here and a little resource centre. So, and I'm Kate Maisey. I'm the Archives Development Manager and I'm an archivist by training. So, in this session, we're going to have a look at some of the most commonly asked questions which we get into our archives inbox. And we're going to give you some pointers as to how you would tackle researching these topics. At the end of that, we'll deal with any sort of questions that you've brought with you today. And then I'm going to ask each of the panel to sort of nominate perhaps an underused resource or a protected source that they'd like people to bear in mind and know more about, or maybe a top tip, or whatever you do, don't do this, all that kind of thing at the end just to round off. So let's start with the first topic then, one of the major things that we get asked to the archives inbox, and it's house history. So, I live in an interesting house, I think it's very old, how can I find out more about it? Or there's a building in my street, I want to know what it used to be before it was converted into a house, all that sort of question. Obviously it's a very big topic, and so we're going to sort of divvy it up and look at different aspects of it, starting with Karen.
So one of the most important things, and one of the earliest things that you ought to do when you're researching a building, is to find it on a map. It sounds obvious, obviously you know where it is, but historic maps can tell you a lot about the building that you're researching, including sometimes giving you a rough date for when it was built. And we have a historic mapping website which a lot of our maps are included on. It's called Know Your Place, and if you Google Know Your Place West of England, you'll find it, and it's got the facility to overlay a modern map with historic maps, including the first, second and third edition Ordnance Survey, which are the 1880s, about 1902 and about 1919. Some areas of the county, we've got later Ordnance Survey maps as well. And also much more historic maps, including tithe and enclosure maps, which can go back from the 1840s to back into the 18th century. Some estate maps, some historic town maps for places like Strad and Gloucester and Cheltenham and so on. And if you want a little bit more information about Know Your Place, if you check our YouTube channel, the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub YouTube channel, we've got a full training session that we did on how to use Know Your Place last year, so you can check that out on there. And one of the other useful sources that you can use are trade directories, which they're a little bit like the Yellow Pages, I suppose. But they've got lists of businesses, public buildings and private residents, which generally tends to be people living in the bigger houses for each parish. And you can look at those on ancestry, and you can sometimes use them to trace the history of a business when it changed hands or changed names, or the history of, if you're living in a former public building such as a school, the directories can be really helpful for that. And another source that's also on Ancestry is the electoral registers, which can be browsed by address. You can search by name if you know the name of a person who was living there, but you can also browse them by street, and just see who was living in the building at the time. And also, I must mention our online catalogue, which is the catalogue information for most of what we hold, although not everything's been listed. But if you put in the address or the place, or if you've got the name of a house, you may well come up with references to documents such as planning and building control records, architects' records potentially, maybe even title deeds. But the thing to remember is that if you don't find anything, it doesn't mean there isn't anything. It just means that we haven't listed it in detail yet. So it's worth having a bit of a look in the online catalogue and seeing what you can find.
Thank you, Karen. So, John, you're going to give us some pointers on how to find out about the people who lived in a house or a building.
Yes, where I would start really, looking at the people, finding out about the people, is to, if you could establish from the directories perhaps, a person in, say, 1910, then you've got a good clue of getting onto the census returns, say the 1911 census, and from the census returns you can then get the names of all the people in the family, how old they were, where they were born, and from that information you can either go back in census returns all the way back to 1841 when census started, or forward to 1921 theoretically, but 1911. I say theoretically 1921 because it is on Find My Past, but you have to pay money to get get the information out from the 1921 census. There was a very good talk by John Putley in the training sessions, which is also on YouTube on Gloucestershire Hub, and he gave that about a month ago, and it was a very good training session. So you find out about the census there. Directories, as you said, they're very useful. You can get the directories for Gloucester, for the main towns and cities, Gloucester, and you get street by street directories, so you can get quite a lot of information. But for rural parishes, it's, as Karen says, it's mainly just the main private residents, main residents in the place. So I think that's what I've got to add at the moment.
Thank you, John. And then I'm going to go to Sue. Sue, what if people live in what they think used to be a police house, or are interested in a former police station? Is there anything that they can look at?
Yes, we do. We don't actually have a comprehensive list. We're still adding to all our information. Because when the constabulary was formed in 1839, often buildings were rented in places where there was a police presence, and these were buildings that were used as police stations, police houses, and barracks. Some of the records were also sent to Bristol when the county boundaries were redesigned in 1974. But to find information on police houses, we use the following sources. We use council plans and architects' drawings. We use lists of police property and property rented from the council that are often held in the archives here. We have memories from officers and their families, old maps and photos, and information from members of the public. Often they'll send me a copy of their deeds and say, this has come up in our deeds. We also have lots of old photographs, and of course there are lots of local websites that will identify police houses. We do have some new pages on our website where one of our volunteers has identified the locations of police stations and houses. She spent I think it's about 2 years trawling through old maps and records. And you can find our website by Googling Gloucestershire Police Archives.
Lovely, thank you, Sue. And John, have you got anything you'd like to add to this one?
Well, just a few points that have been touched on already, really. One is that, of course, local authority records will include quite a lot to do with, well, since 1940s, with the planning process, and before that with building control. So there will be deposited building plans, not comprehensively, but for many buildings built during the 20th century. And of course, for buildings that are built by local authorities, council houses and similar buildings, they will have a lot of information, very likely, including plans, but also the debates in council meetings beforehand. And for older buildings, if they're quite distinguished, they may well be listed. And then, of course, you can see what the list says about them, the list itself, which may give a date and certainly give an architectural description. So there are a few more things.
Thank you. As we said, it's a massive topic, but we do have some guidance on how to get started on our website as well. So we've got a section called Starting Your House History, and that will lead you to at least a couple of downloadable house history resources. Sorry, when I say our website, I meant the Gloucestershire Archives website on that occasion. So I can't see any questions in the chat about house history. So let's move on to the next quite commonly asked question and topic that we get to the archives inbox. This is a bit of a surprising one to me, at least, because it's about vehicle licensing records. So we get quite a lot of inquiries about this, and I think it's usually because people have got some sort of vintage car or motorcycle or sort of treasured vehicle that they want to get back onto the road, and so they need to get it licensed. And we do hold some records here that could potentially help with that. So, Karen, could you tell us something about that?
I can. We've got, the first thing to say is that we've got a research guide on vehicle licensing records on our website, on the Gloucestershire Archives website. From the front page, if you click Starting Your Research and then click Research Mini Guides, you'll find there's an enormous list. We've got lots and lots of them, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But if you scroll all the way down to the bottom to V, you will find vehicle licensing. And this gives you a quick overview of what to do if you're looking for the licensing records for a historic vehicle. Now these begin, these records, in 1903, and each county was allocated an index mark of 2 letters. And we've got 2 county areas where we've got some records for, and that's the county of Gloucestershire, whose index marks were AD, DD, DF and DG, and the city of Gloucester, whose index mark was FH. And for the county, I'll just show you this. The Bristol and Gloucestershire Archaeological Society has recently published a list of all of the vehicle registration records that we've got for the county of Gloucestershire between 1903 and 1913. So if your vehicle happens to be between those 10 in that 10-year period and registered in Gloucestershire, the details will be in that book, and that's available both in the research room here at Gloucestershire Archives in the hub, but also at the Family History Society. Now the records that we've got, the county records, are quite comprehensive. We've got registers and index cards which give you information about the name and address of the owner, and a description of the vehicle, including the colour, which is rather nice. For the city, we've got a little less. We've got some sample files and logbooks and some microfilms of licence renewals. And this actually shows up an issue with nationally the vehicle licensing records. They're not complete. Unfortunately, a lot were thrown away by presumably obsolete vehicle licensing departments in other counties when the vehicle licensing was handed over to the DVLA in 1974. Although I'm told that the bus museum in Droitwich has a large collection of vehicle licensing records. So if your vehicle isn't Gloucestershire, if it's got a different index mark, different letters, there's a handy list on Wikipedia of the different areas and which which area the letters correspond to, and then you'll have to do a little bit of research to find out whether the records survive and where they're kept. Just a quick thing to note about the research mini guide is that we're in the process of recataloguing the county vehicle licensing records, so they will soon have a new reference number. We're going to update the research guide, but if you do a free text search for the reference number that's given in the guide in the interim, you will still find the records on our online catalogue.
Right, thank you, Karen. And Sue, what about if people are interested in finding out about a police car or police vehicle?
Any police vehicle that we have photographs of, we tend to put them on our database and record the registration mark. So if anybody came to us and said, have you had this vehicle, we can search for them, but it's not a comprehensive list. I do have a new willing volunteer who's going to work on compiling a more comprehensive list from this and other sources to make it much easier for us to search. But we don't often get inquiries. It tends to be from people who are, as you say, doing up old vehicles that may at once have been a police vehicle.
Okay, thank you. So, John L., have you got anything you'd like to add to this?
I don't think I've got anything to add about that vehicle licensing. Sorry, Karen.
Well, it's a bit niche, isn't it? But I think other John, you have, haven't you?
Yes, I had a couple more points. But one is that, as Karen said, the bus archive. These were enthusiasts, and they salvaged a lot of ones that would have records that would otherwise have been destroyed. They have a list of what they have, but they used to be called the Kithead Trust, and the list is on that website rather than the bus archive site. Many local authorities did preserve their records, so you might be in Gloucestershire, but you find that your car was registered in Cumbria or something like that. So it may well survive. But the other thing I was going to just mention was that a lot of people are interested in old photographs, and very often town scenes or even out in the country, there will be a vehicle somewhere in shot. And if you can read the registration number, and if it's a local one, as it's likely to be, they didn't move quite so far in the past. If it's a local one, you may well be able to date the photograph, or at least date what date it must be after. And sometimes, of course, you can tell who the people sitting in his car, or the driver, the owner of the car will also be recorded.
Oh, thank you. Brilliant. What's it? Okay, so stunned you all into silence with vehicle licensing, nothing in the chat. So let's have a look at the next frequently asked topic. So we get people wanting to know how to find out about the history of their village or their town or their neighbourhood. So John C., let's start with you for this one.
You can imagine this is a vast topic. People might think that a small village, perhaps no more than 100 people, wouldn't have much history. But if you multiply those 100 people back through a millennium, when the village probably started, you're probably looking at 3,000 or 4,000 lives. What these people did, how they made a living, how they affected their surroundings, what their lifestyle was like. So it's a vast treasure trove of information that you might be looking for. Now, there are loads of sources that one can use, but I thought perhaps more useful is to go back to the beginning of this and think, how are you going to organise any research you're going to do on the place you're interested in? I work for an organisation called the Victoria County History, and we've done what you might call organised parish histories for about half of Gloucestershire, half the places in Gloucestershire, and it operates in other places as well. Most of our published research is online via the British History Online website. And as I say, we summarise parish history, and we have a kind of template into which we fit the subjects. And I think even if you're not working for us, or it's not a parish that we've done. The framework that we use is probably a good starting point for the way to organise research on a parish history, village history. And history, all history, is always about asking questions, so we can phrase it in questions. And the first sort of set of questions that you might ask about the place you're going to study is to do with what is it like? So what is its extremities, its boundaries? Have they changed? Its terrain, its hills, rivers? How have people moved about through and outside the parish? So its roads and bridges principally, and its country lanes, but also any railways or canals that have gone through or affected it. How many people live there now, the population, and in the past, was it more or fewer, different? And have they always lived in one place, in a village, or have they been scattered throughout a wider area? And what the buildings look like, and whether they've always looked like that, and what they're made of. So there's a whole string of questions like that to begin with. Then the other subjects perhaps deal with it in a little less detail. Who has owned the village? Somebody has been the landowner, maybe one person, maybe a lot. It may be a big corporation like the church or the state even, or it may be one big landed family who held land all over the area and in lots of other places, or it may have belonged to lots of small landowners, and they may have changed hands over the years. So there's ownership of the place you're studying is one subject. And then what we call the economic history, how people have made a living. And that's usually mostly about the changing patterns of farming, but there may be forestry or quarrying or just normal trades, but also perhaps some specialist industry to be looked at. Then there's the question of how people get along with each other, social history. So whether they're enjoying themselves or bettering themselves or looking after each other. So the pubs and the clubs, schools, charities, welfare. And then there's who's been in charge, and this will be how the landowners exercise control at one level, and then how the parish church, the parish vestry, and later the parish council, how they've been involved in organising and administering the place. And finally, we look at, and it's perhaps less important now than it was in the past, but people's religion, so the importance of the church in the community, and not just the church, but chapels and the clergy that go with them. So these are all questions and topics that to think about, and you probably select from if you're going to start working on a village. So you might just be interested in the Methodist chapel, for example. And of course, for each of these, there'll be different sources available, and we have plenty of information to give you about that. And of course, the information comes in various forms. So previous books published about the place, or my Victoria County History series, maps, newspapers, reminiscences for recent history, photographs, of course, and all manner of documents, which this building is absolutely full of.
Thank you, John. That's a sort of definitive introduction there to a very big topic, as you say, but I don't know if does anyone want to chip in? Other John?
Yes, just a plug for local history societies, really, because probably quite in your area that you're researching, probably you find a local history society, and they usually have a wealth of information about the area. Might be old photographs and so on. And you could find out if you have got a local history society in the area from the Gloucestershire Local History Association. You go on their website and they see a list of all the local history societies.
Yeah, great point. Thank you very much. And just as we were saying before, you know, it is a big subject, but we do have some basic information on the Gloucestershire Archives website and starting to research the history of your area, and that will lead you to a couple of downloads again with resources which you might want to consider. Okay, so nothing in the chat, so let's move on to our next topic of inquiry, which is how can you find out about an ancestor who was in the police? Obviously, Sue, this one's got your name all over it.
Thank you. We use a variety of methods and sources to track down information about members of the constabulary. Our major tome is the Register of Rural Constabulary that lists every officer between 1839 and 1919. Now, I say every officer, but these were only the PCs and sergeants, and actually we have superintendents who came straight in at the start of the constabulary who aren't actually listed in there. So if somebody says my ancestor was one of the first superintendents, it can be quite difficult to try and track them down. We do have the lists from this book on the website, and we're hoping to have pictures on there very soon. We also use the Variations of Constabulary, which is a book that is beautifully handwritten and is the officers who joined the constabulary, left the constabulary and moved within the force. We then look at general orders, which has similar information, but it also includes things like promotions, awards, sanctions, permissions to marry. I mean, it wasn't until the 1980s that you could get married without the Chief Constable's permission. We also use photographs, census records, newspaper reports, personnel files. I do have 2 personnel files to show the difference. You can have one like this that is full to bursting, or you can just have one like this that has got about 3 pieces of paper in. So you can hit lucky, but you can also we can also find that your ancestor no longer has a personnel file in existence. We're very lucky with the number that we do have, but it's by no means all of them. The other thing that people think is really easy to track an officer by is their collar number. Every officer has a unique joining number, but the collar numbers were reissued. And until about the 1950s, they were reissued straight away. After the 1950s, it was about 5 years apart. This means it's very difficult to track people. So if, for example, Officer 356 left on the 31st of May, the next officer who joined on the 1st of June was also issued 356. Once an officer was promoted to inspector, they also lost their collar number, and again it was reissued. This means that the same number was issued several times in a short period of time. And as there was no sick pay until quite late on in the constabulary, often officers resigned until they were well enough to come back to duty. So again, that would be a lot of people with the same number. I did look up some numbers, and I found that the number 23, 5 officers were issued that number between 1911 and 1919, obviously because of the comings and goings of the First World War. And the number 173 was issued 8 times between 1911 and 1956. So again, it makes it quite difficult to identify people on undated photographs taken at a roughly the same period, especially if the officers are actually wearing their helmets. So, it can be quite difficult to track people through their collar numbers.
Thanks, Sue. And you mentioned that Register of Rural Constabulary, which I know is a key source, and it goes, I think you said, from 1839 to 1919. That includes quite a lot of information, doesn't it? Am I right in saying it's got people's height?
Yes, it's got their height. It doesn't have their date of birth, but it says how old they were when they joined the constabulary. It will also say what their previous occupation was, and will also say who recommended them to be an officer, because in those days you had to be recommended. And if you applied to be an officer, inquiries were made in the village or the area that you came from with the local police to make sure that you were a suitable candidate. The only thing that we find that constrains us with the Register of Royal Constabulary is lots of people are listed as labourers. And we know that during the whole time of the constabulary, officers had to be able to read and write. So they were probably not what we would think of as labourers. But it seems to be quite common up until about 1900 that if you weren't highly skilled at something, you were just registered as a labourer.
Thanks, Sue. And I see we've got a relevant question in the chat. Someone's asked, are there any records of police medals and honours? And they thought possibly in the London Gazette.
We do actually try and find as many references as we can to everybody. Again, we've just identified that although we've got bravery medals recorded in some of our publications, now that things are electronic, they're recorded in a different way, and we're trying to get some way of making sure that they are recorded and kept for posterity.
What's those silver braid? Is it the silver braid register?
The
Is
silver,
that anything to do with it?
the silver braid was formed in 1920. It was after the First World War. The Chief Constable at the time thought that the officers weren't being rewarded for brave acts. It seemed to be often stopping runaway horses. And so he initiated the silver braid. So if you have a picture of a police officer and you can see that they've got a medal ribbon on the wrong side of their uniform, that is usually a silver braid, and it'll just be one medal ribbon compared to all the others that they will have on the proper pocket area.
So is that something that somebody could find out more about?
They could, but we only had about 30 officers, I think, were awarded that, because it went from 1920 to 1955. And you had to do something considered very brave. There was only one woman awarded a silver braid, and she got that in, I think it was the 1930s, for helping a male police officer for arresting a suspect.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see we've got a question about the Register of Royal Constabulary. Does it cover all counties or just Gloucestershire? Oh, I think even I can. That's Gloucestershire.
It is just Gloucestershire, yes.
Yeah. Good to clarify that. So, we have got a couple of other questions in the chat, but I'm inclined to take those at the end, if that's okay. So I know we've got one about land tax registers, and we've got one about records of the Strad voluntary fire service. So we will come back to those. And we've got one final sort of frequently asked question which we wanted to cover today, and that's to do with people wanting to know how to find out more about an ancestor who was in a mental hospital or an asylum, as it was often termed in those days. So I'm going to ask Karen to start and just outline the sources that we've got here at Gloucestershire Archives and how people might go about accessing them.
Okay, so we've got a large collection of records relating to the Barnwood House private asylum and a few records relating to private asylum at Fairford. There was also a private asylum at Fish Ponds down near Bristol, and their records are at Bristol Record Office, as I understand. But there were also two public asylums, if you like, the first and second county asylums, both of them in Gloucester. The first county asylum was built in 1823 and it was in Horton Road in Gloucester. And the second county asylum was opened at Coney Hill in 1885, and they closed in 1988 for Horton Road and 1994 for Coney Hill. And they generally, they treated people who couldn't afford the private asylums. So most ordinary people with mental health issues would probably end up in either Horton Road or Coney Hill. And we've got 2 large collections of records relating to them, including things like admission and discharge books, registers of patients, case books, case papers, medical files, all of that sort of thing. It's important to remember that these records, obviously by their very nature, contain a lot of very sensitive personal information, and so they are all closed for 100 years. And that closure period runs from the last date in the record. So if it's a register of patients that runs from 1920 to 1926, although the first couple of years would be open, the book, for ease of use, is closed until the 1st of January 1927. So what we do is we add 100 years and then 1, and it becomes available on the 1st of January of the next year, just to make sure that nothing becomes open slightly before its 100 years are up. And also the permission to access these records all goes through the owners of the records. So in the case of Barnwood House, it's the Barnwood House Trust. And in the case of Horton Road and Coney Hill, it goes via the modern day NHS Mental Health Trust. So we would refer requests to them, and then they will look at the records and they prepare a report on the records using modern terminology to explain the often quite upsetting terms to modern eyes that would have been used by the historic doctors at the time. So, for example, calling people lunatics and other unpleasant things. So they will produce a proper report for you. Several of the admission and discharge books have been indexed by volunteers, and those index entries are available via our online catalogue. So it is worth having a search for your ancestor's name. They go up to about 1919. So it's all information that can be made available. So it can tell you whether or not one of these admissions or discharges includes details about a particular person. So those are worth searching for. There's also a mini research guide on asylum and mental hospital records, again on our website, and on our YouTube channel there's a short video tutorial on how to use the records. Also worth bearing in mind is that some mental hospitals appear on the census. Sometimes the inmates are only named by their initials, but some actually give their full names. So if you're lucky and your ancestor was in the mental hospital at the time of the census, their name may well be recorded. And another thing to bear in mind is that some people with what we would now call mental health issues might not have qualified to be transferred to the asylum, so they may have remained in the workhouse. And we do have records for most of the workhouses in Gloucestershire, although their survival is a little bit patchy, but worth looking for. I think that's all I've got.
I think we've got a mini guide about workhouses as well.
I think we have, yes. I have a list. I think we do, yeah.
Pretty sure we have. Brilliant. Anybody else got anything they'd like to add into to that one? Oh, John, yeah.
Yes, a couple of things. I had a look at the National Archives website, and they have a guide regarding asylums, and there's also a link there to an ancestry where they have UK admissions register, the whole of UK admissions register from 1846 to 1912. So that might be worth looking at. I've checked there, and they have got the Gloucester ones on there as well. The other thing I'd like to just mention is that, of course, if they were died unfortunately in the workhouse, they quite often were buried in Tredworth Cemetery, and the Gloucestershire Family History Society on their resources on the computer there, they have we have all the burials listed from 1857 to 2013, in fact, in Tredworth Cemetery. So it's worth looking at that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody else? Shall we move on? Okay, so let's have a look at the questions that have come in via the chat then. There's some new topics. So the first one's about land tax registers. So there's a description of the property, but not an address. Is there a way of discovering the exact address of the property? John, yeah.
Well, I'm thinking you're meaning referring to land tax assessments, for which there's quite a good collection for the period about 1780 to about 1830s, arranged by 100, the old administrative unit of 100. But the ones for Gloucestershire are, I'm pretty sure, on Ancestry. If you're lucky, there will be one for each parish for each year in that 50 or so year period. And it won't give the address. However, if you compare one year with the next, there usually not much changes from one year to the next. But if you methodically go through them, you will sometimes find, well, obviously people die or you find the widow, but the amount taxed is usually the same. And if it suddenly changes, it suggests either that they've built a new house or combined two houses or something like that. And although you won't find the address there, you'll be able to track, roughly who is there in the parish and relatively how big their property is compared with the others. And you may well have it in that span of the period, some estate maps, or right at the end of the period, you'll have the tithe map, but you may well have an enclosure map during that period. And that will probably show you who was living in which house at the time of the map. So if you're clever, you can sometimes use land tax records alongside maps to in fact find out what you're asking there, whether you can find the address of a property if somebody's mentioned in a land tax assessment. I think that's what you're getting at, but that's certainly the class of records I've used for sort of thing.
Yeah, that's true. Anybody got any other thoughts?
Wouldn't add anything else.
No. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful. And then we've also got a question, do we have any records for the Strad voluntary fire service?
Just a quick thought on that. I could try the Strad Local History Society to see if they have any information. And also newspapers, of course, worth consulting newspapers, British newspapers online. You might be able to find some information from that.
Thanks, John. And I think Karen's got something to offer on this one as well.
Yes, I would say have a search on our online catalogue. It's linked to from the front page of our website. You can do a search for any text. So if you put Strad Voluntary Fire Service or Strad Fire, and that will show you what we've got. And in fact, for any have you got the records of questions, first port of call I'd say would be have a look at the online catalogue, because we've got at least summary descriptions of everything that we hold. Not everything has been listed in detail, but there should at least be a summary description of what we've got. And I see there's been a question about finding the tithe maps. They're on the Know Your Place website, and then on our Gloucestershire Archives website, there is a database of the tithe apportionments, which is the list of who was owning and occupying each piece of land, each numbered plot of land. And the Know Your Place web address is kypwest.org.uk. And then if you scroll down on their front page and click the link for Gloucestershire, you'll be able to go into the map for Gloucestershire. But as I said earlier, there's a tutorial on how to use Know Your Place on our Heritage Hub YouTube channel.
Thanks, Karen. And go on, John.
Just one more word about fire services. We would normally include information about fire services in the parishes that we cover in the Victoria County history. Strad is in volume 11 of our series, and that is online. So you could probably go to that, and there would be perhaps a paragraph about provision for fire protection in Strad, and that will mention, I suspect, the voluntary fire service.
And am I right in saying that the beauty of finding things in the Victoria County history is that you footnote everything? And so if you've based your information on documents, for example, held at Gloucestershire Archives or any other archive, in fact, you would put that in the footnote as to where you found it?
Yes, this is perfectly true. Of course, for older volumes, you archivists have sometimes changed the numbers, but we can usually get back to the to what we're trying to find. Yes, we always footnote everything that we use.
Thank you. And I was just going to add something. Karen mentioned searching on our online catalogue. So try as we might to make this a very simple and intuitive process. You know, I know it is. It can be a bit tricky. We've changed software recently, and we think the new software definitely helps. But if you really want to be confident about getting the best out of the online catalogue, we've done a tutorial quite recently talking about how to do that and sort of demonstrating how to use it to its best. And again, you can find that on the Gloucestershire Heritage Hub YouTube channel, so that's well worth a look. Just scanning the chat, so nothing else in there. Let's move on then to asking people to just finish off by going through any top tips or advice or resources they want to sort of draw to your attention. And let's start down here with Karen.
Okay, I just want to highlight again our mini research guides, which are available on the website. Just to remind you where to find them, if you go to the Archives website, which is www.gloucestershire.gov.uk/archives, and then if you click on starting your research, that will take you through to a page with lots of links. And the top one, research mini guides, click on that and that will load you a page with over 70 different guides on different topics, different collections. Very usefully, the very first one is which guide to choose, but then they're available alphabetically, and they start with alehouse licensing records, and they run on through topics like apprenticeship, the asylums that we've already covered, boards of guardians and workhouse, coroners' records, district councils, electoral registers, the free miners in the Forest of Dean jail records, hedgerows, all sorts of things, all the way down to vehicle licensing, wills and probate. And right at the very bottom of the list is the 1910 valuation maps, which I know John's going to speak about in a moment. And also check our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and search for Gloucestershire Heritage Hub, we've got recordings of all of our previous events and training sessions that we've done over the last few years on all sorts of topics. So if there were any that you didn't get to, or any you weren't aware were happening, you can check those out.
Great, thanks, Karen. I'd just like to second the plug for the mini guides, because very often they will actually give you the collection references to search for in the online catalogue to find that particular category of material. So we were just talking about how to find things via the online catalogue. That's a real kind of shortcut for you, if it actually tells you the collection reference to put in. So that's another good reason to check those out. Okay, so moving on to John then, what would you like to tell us about?
Well, one of my favourites is the Lloyd George Survey of Land Values. Karen has just mentioned the maps, the land survey maps. Very briefly, Lloyd George in his budget in 1909 proposed to raise tax by the increase in the value of land. And obviously to do this, all property had to be surveyed. There was a lot of discussion in the House of Lords whether to pass it. And in fact, they didn't pass the budget, but they did, in fact, a year later. As it was a tax, it was organised through the Inland Revenue Offices. And here in Gloucestershire, the two Inland Revenue Offices were in Gloucester and Cheltenham, and they divided the county up between them. And they had a vast army of surveyors which went round to all the properties, all the land and the properties in Gloucestershire, and surveyed the extent of the land and who owned it and who was living there or who occupied it. And There were basically three forms, two of which are in the Gloucestershire Archives, which is the Domesday Book, which is a book which lists all the properties and all the details of the properties, and also the Form 37s, which were sent to the owners for them to either dispute what the surveyors had found or agree to it. And also in the National Archives, there are the field books, which the surveyors took round when they went to the properties and recorded all the information about the properties in these field books. We also have, of course, they had the maps, and they used the second edition of the 25-inch Ordnance Survey maps, which were suitably prepared for them. Although those were about 1903, they were prepared, and they're beautifully coloured maps, really worth looking at. And on the maps, they've actually put a number against every property. So you can link the property you see on a map with the information on that property and who owned it and who occupied it. And this is all now on a website, which is Gloss 1909 survey. And it's a very valuable source because particularly in rural areas, the census returns, they do not list, houses did not have numbers or names, most of the houses in those days when the census were taken. And therefore, this is a method of actually finding out exactly where someone actually lived in these rural areas. So that's one of my favourite sources.
Great, thank you, John. So we'll just pause doing the top tips and the favourite sources because I've seen we've got a question about the 1901 to 1931 census returns.
1801.
Sorry, 1801 to 1831 census returns for Gloucestershire. Never been able to find any tips.
Yeah, one or two parishes did take the census. I mean, as Eileen says there, they were census, and they were actually just recording the numbers of people, basically. But for instance, Bisley, there are the census returns for 1821 and 1831 for Bisley. And if you go to and look in the catalogue of the archives here, you might well find it, possibly. In fact, I'm sure you'll find it.
Oh, that's interesting. So, because I thought that those very early census returns were just sort of published as statistical information. So are you saying that there are a few parishes where
yes,
they
but
did
while
do it
they
in more detail?
But while they were gathering the information on numbers, they actually wrote down the names of the people in the houses.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thank you.
I think these are known as unofficial censuses, and to be distinguished from census reports, which of course are the printed reports that resulted from taking the 1801 to 1831 censuses. And the reports exist, and we have them here behind us, but the returns very rarely survive. They weren't taken as returns as a rule.
Okay, thank you. So let's carry on then with the resources that we want to mention and any top tips. So John, what have you got?
Me again, yes. A source that has become increasingly valuable and in a way is a game changer for local historians is the British Newspaper Archive, which if you want to look at it at home, there's an annual subscription, but you can see it in libraries and record offices, archives. And this is basically millions of pages of local and national newspapers, going back in some cases to the 18th century, not coming right up to date as a rule, but coming up to the post-war period. And because they're indexed, you can search for a village or a farm even, and you potentially will come up with hundreds and hundreds of hits and take you all day to go through looking for bits of information about the place you're interested in. As you'll know, if you have ever been mentioned in a local newspaper, they probably got it slightly wrong, whatever it was they were trying to say. So you have to take some of the information you see in old newspapers and check it. But on the other hand, there's a plethora of advertisements, buildings being auctioned, cats and dogs being lost, people being run over, accidents, fires, all manner of things. And it really enables you to build up a picture of details of life in a village or town, which you might not find very easily elsewhere. Now, not all newspapers have so far been included, but nevertheless, certainly in the 19th century, local newspapers had much more of a regional feel, and they would syndicate information from one to another. So even if the newspaper that you would read if you lived in Stow-on-the-Wold, for example, hadn't been indexed, the one for Cirencester or Cheltenham might have been, and it may well have the information you want. Once you've got the date of something happening, you can then go back to hard copies of newspapers that aren't included, and you will find a good account. Very often a different slant on things as well. So good to look at more than one newspaper if you can.
Lovely, thank you very much, John. And Sue, what would you like to finish on?
My top tip is, I think, whatever you do, and whatever information you find, check and check again, because quite often spelling changes or mistakes are made in transcribing documents. We had a family called Hellier looking for their police ancestor, and I found him as Hillier. And the family said, oh, no, he would have been Hellier because he hated being called Hillier. And when we tracked it back, on his birth certificate, they'd put Hillier instead of Hellier. And because that was official, that's how he had joined the police, even though it clearly, when you looked back in the records, his family were Hellier. So, you know, it's always check and make sure that you are looking at the right person, or that the right person hasn't been categorised wrongly.
Yes, thank you very much. And with that, we are pretty much bang on 2 o'clock. So no more questions have appeared in the chat. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for joining us. We'll be posting this recording of the session onto the Gloucestershire Heritage YouTube channel soon, in about a week. So I'm aware we sort of spoken about quite a lot of information, so if you didn't manage to sort of catch it all, you can perhaps go back and have another look at it that way. When you signed up to the course, or the session I should say, you'll have been sent a sort of feedback form, so we'd encourage you to fill that in. In fact, you can use that to flag up, say, any other sort of topics or training areas that you'd like us to think about offering. And that's it. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.